All right, let's get into it. We're doing a focus revision explainer on Edward I, and he was really a king of two halves. On one hand, you got this meticulous lawmaker, a guy totally obsessed with order and control. And on the other, you've got this fearsome warrior who literally redrew the map of Britain. So let's get you totally prepped for that exam. So here's our game plan. We're going to break down Edward's reign into 4 key areas. And you'll notice this mirrors the AQA spec perfectly, so it's a great way to structure your notes. We'll kick off with Edward the Lawmaker, then we'll look at what life was actually like in his kingdom, then we get to the big stuff, his military campaigns, and we'll wrap up by looking at how you can absolutely smash that historic environment question. Okay, let's dive right into part 1, Edward the Lawmaker. We're going to look at the absolute mess he inherited when he became king, and, more importantly, how he used the law as a tool, not just to clean things up, but to build the very foundations of his incredible power. So try to picture this, right? Edward's been off on crusade, and he gets back in 1274 to find England is, well, it's a bit of a state. His dad, Henry III, wasn't exactly the strongest of kings, and in his absence, the big-shot nobles, the barons, they'd been running wild, basically carving out their own little kingdoms and completely ignoring the king's authority. The whole country needed a firm hand and fast. And this is where you see his genius. Edward doesn't just charge in with an army. No, he comes in with an army of clerks and lawyers. The 100 Rolls, think of it like a Doomsday Book 2.0, a massive survey to find out exactly who owned what and who had what rights. Then, the Statutes of Westminster laid down new laws for everyone. But the real kicker was the Quo Warranto inquiries. This was Edward marching up to the most powerful men in the country and asking, by what warrant do you hold this power? He was forcing them to prove they had the right to it. These were the building blocks of his authority. Now here's the really clever part. This wasn't just about Edward grabbing all the power for himself, it was about building consent. The Model Parliament of 1295 was, a game changer, because for the first time it brought in regular knights from the shires and burgesses from the towns. And why would he do that? Simple, money. Edward needed cash for his wars, and he figured out a fundamental truth of politics. It is way easier to tax people if they feel like they've had some say in the decision. You see, the lawmaker is directly funding the warrior. So let's move on and see how this all connects. Part 2, Life in Medieval England. Because, look, a strong government needs a strong economy to pay for it all. So how did Edward's big legal changes actually affect the money, the trade, and the daily life of everyone in the kingdom? What's so interesting here is the massive shift it shows. Edward basically professionalized how the king made money. He looked at England's wool trade, which was the best in Europe, by the way, and thought, right, I'm having a piece of that. So he created a new national tax on it. He brought in expert Italian bankers to manage his loans, and in 1279, he introduced brand new, reliable coins. Suddenly, the wool trade was the engine powering his entire treasury. And his new rules really did touch everybody's lives. The Statute of Merchants, for example, made it safer and easier for people to do business. Other laws sorted out local justice and policing. But there's a much darker side to all this. The expulsion of the Jews in 1290, it was a brutal, calculated move. Not only did he seize their assets to fill his own pockets, but he also cut off a major source of loans for his nobles, which, you guessed it, made them even more dependent on him. All right, now for the bit everyone remembers. Part 3, Edward the Warrior. With his kingdom more organized and his finances stronger than they had ever been, Edward could finally turn his full attention to his massive military ambitions, and he had his eyes set on Wales and Scotland. His conquest of Wales was just swift, brutal, and totally decisive. The First War in 1277 basically put the Welsh prince, Llewellyn ap Gruffydd, in his place. But when Llewellyn's brother started a rebellion a few years later, Edward came back with absolutely overwhelming force. Llewellyn was hunted down and killed, and by 1284, the Statute of Rhuddlan was passed. It pretty much erased Welsh law and imposed English rule. Just like that, the conquest was done. And this is how he made sure Wales stayed conquered. 100,000 pounds. I mean, you have to understand, in the 13th century, that is a mind-boggling, astronomical amount of money. And he spent it on building the Ring of Iron, a chain of the most advanced, most terrifying castles in the world, like Caernarfon and Conwy. This wasn't just about defense. This was a statement. It was a symbol of permanent, crushing English power, all paid for by that new financial system he built. After he was done with Wales, Edward turned his gaze north, to Scotland, and his actions there were so ruthless, so determined, that they eventually carved this fearsome title onto his tomb, Scotorum Malleus, the Hammer of the Scots. So it all kicked off with something called the Great Cause, which was basically a crisis over who should be the next Scottish king. Edward was invited to be the judge, but he used it as an excuse to declare himself the overlord of all of Scotland. Of course, the Scots weren't having that, and it led directly to the First War of Scottish Independence, a long, bloody, brutal conflict where Edward found himself up against legendary figures like William Wallace and later on, Robert the Bruce.
So, how does all of this come together for your exam? Well, that brings us to part 4, the legacy in stone. That last bit of the paper always asks you to analyze a specific historic site. So the question is, how do we see Edward's entire reign reflected in the incredible buildings he left behind?
This right here is your essential checklist. This is your toolkit for that question. Whatever site they give you, just apply these questions. Why is it there? What was it actually for? What's special about how it was built? And this is the most important one. How does it connect back to the big events we've been talking about? You have to think of the site not as just a pile of old stones, but as a piece of historical evidence that's telling you the story of Edward's power. So I'm going to leave you with this one big question to guide the rest of your revision. How does a Welsh castle represent the total power of Edward I? Because when you really look at one of those castles, you're not just seeing a fortress. You are seeing his legal system that organized the thousands of men to build it. You're seeing his financial reforms that paid for every single stone. And you're seeing his raw military ambition that put it there in the first place. It's the lawmaker and the warrior fused together into one colossal, intimidating structure. If you can understand that, you will understand the reign of Edward I. Good luck.